and was very experienced in catching her husband cheating at home for the first time. Even though she trapped him in her bed, she did not lose control of her emotions and argued. She did not accuse him of infidelity in tears, but packed her luggage elegantly throughout the whole process. She planned to leave the room to the unfaithful couple. Not only that, before leaving, and also zipped up her skirt for him, and her husband Dan was not panicked at all. Because they had been married for many years, the family had always been supported by Dan alone, and he did not believe that his wife, Anne, would dare to leave. However, Anne was obviously determined to leave not only herself, but also take her 2 sons with her, because Anne did not want to leave her children to be raised by a cheating husband. In this way, Anne turned around and left with her suitcase. However, when Anne came to the school to pick up her 2 sons, she was told that the children had already transferred to another school. Obviously, she was not a qualified mother and did not pay much attention to her sons. After finally finding a new school for her sons and picking up her 2 sons as she wished, Anne went to the bank again and took out all her savings plus a pistol for self-defense. Finally, she took off her ring and threw it into the safe, saying goodbye to this marriage completely. Later, in order to travel conveniently, Anne spent a lot of money to buy a sports car with the help of her youngest son. Then, Anne took her 2 sons to embark on a new chapter in life. In fact, at first, the youngest son, Robbie, didn't want to run away from home at all. But then she thought that her mother might just be impulsive, and she would probably compromise and go home within a week. So Robbie got in the car and took on the responsibility of driver, and also saw his little thoughts, but didn't explain too much. It was just that when Robbie frequently looked at the rearview mirror and told him to focus on the road ahead and not to miss the past, because they came to Boston to seek refuge with relatives. But it happened that the relatives were traveling at this time and had not returned, so they could only temporarily rest in the hotel. Unexpectedly, as soon as she arrived at the hotel, and ran into her former suitor. The other party seemed to still have feelings for her and insisted on inviting her to dinner in the evening. In that era when women's values were confined to the family, Anne's original plan was to find a new support for herself and her children, so she gladly accepted the invitation. However, just as she was dressing up for the banquet, Robbie reminded her not to have too much hope. At first, he was full of confidence and didn't care, but he didn't expect that his eldest son George would come true. It turned out that the man urgently needed a large sum of money for turnover due to business failure. Anne's ex-husband Dan was a famous musician who had no worries about having no money to spend, so the man set his sights on Anne. Not to mention that Anne had divorced Dan and had no spare money to help. Even if she had money, she would not help a man who had not seen her for many years and asked to borrow money as soon as they met. In order to calm down, Anne temporarily left the table and went to the bathroom on the pretext of putting on makeup. Unexpectedly, when she came back, the man had not only left, but also stole all the cash in her wallet. As a result, Anne could not even pay for the meal. For an elegant and face-saving woman, it was wrong to be mistaken for not paying for the meal and forced to leave the restaurant. Fortunately, at this time, a colonel in military uniform and polite appeared in time and helped her out. The appearance of this officer resolved the embarrassment in time, and soon the 2 kissed and quickly reached the stage of engagement. However, this seemingly gentle and considerate colonel has an unknown side behind him. He always likes to talk about his political opinions at the table and does not allow anyone to disobey and refute. This day, George just expressed his opinion, and he conducted an obedience test on him as an elder and an official. The colonel said that you 3 are dogs, and only he is the master. For dogs, loyalty and obedience are the most important qualities, so the colonel hopes that they can all have them. Hearing this, George was furious, but soon calmed down. It was not because he was afraid of coercion, but because he was worried that his mother's support would disappear because of his impulse. And, who had no idea, was still happily preparing for the wedding. That day, she brought her 2 sons to the mall to buy items needed for the wedding banquet. When they just walked to the escalator, they happened to meet a group of disabled children. Suddenly, the mother and her 2 children were filled with sympathy and donated all the only $500 they had. Unexpectedly, the colonel was furious when he found out, and, who was frightened, quickly said that she would find a way to make up for the financial gap. However, the colonel did not believe that a woman could earn so much money. So he was furious and asked for the pearl necklace on Anne's neck and even tried to violently snatch it. Seeing this, Anne ran downstairs like she was escaping. But he was soon cornered by the colonel. Fortunately, George arrived in time and clamped him from behind. However, he was thrown to the ground in the next second. Seeing her son being hurt, Anne's protective feelings suddenly broke out. She quickly picked up a pointed iron rod and pointed it at the colonel and warned him harshly. If he dared to take another step forward, she would not be polite. After saying that, she pulled off her necklace and threw it at the colonel who was standing opposite. Then she took George away, even though the people she met along the way were not good people. However, and still did not give up and thought about finding another person to rely on. Because in the United States in 1953, women were often confined to small families. There were very few opportunities to work, and even the advertisements at that time. They objectified them as accessories that could be conquered or owned. And their value was often defined by marriage and family. Even Anne, who was ambitious, was not immune to the situation. With little money left, and could only rent a cheap apartment after arriving at her new destination. Therefore, George once wanted to go back to find his father Dan, but Anne said that no matter how bad the situation was, some bottom lines had to be upheld. In fact, Dan had been sending money to Anne, but she returned it intact. After settling down in the local area, Anne quickly found a new date with her outstanding appearance. When they first met, the other party tried to forcefully violate her. In the end, Anne, who resisted with all her might, was ruthlessly driven out of the car and fell heavily to the ground. But even if she was humiliated like this, Anne would never waste her energy on it. Because Anne firmly believed that no matter how embarrassing the situation was, she deserved to be respected and treated well. However, the increasingly tight financial situation forced her to pawn the jewelry left by her grandmother. After leaving the pawn shop, Anne, who was in a low mood, happened to meet a new neighbor. The neighbor was a cold and taciturn man, but whenever he faced Anne, he would become enthusiastic and cheerful. This time he took the initiative to go to the bar for a drink, but Anne declined the offer. It was not because Anne deliberately put on a high profile, but because there was a more important banquet waiting for her to attend. It turned out that Anne had contacted a rich second-generation man who had briefly pursued her many years ago. When they met again, Anne thought they could rekindle their past relationship. But George thought it was unrealistic, because there was a dozen years age difference between Anne and the rich second-generation man. At first, Anne didn't take it seriously, but when she arrived at the date, sure enough, she heard the rich second-generation man complaining to his female companion about her old age and fading beauty, and who was hit hard, went to the bar alone to drink. At this time, the man next to her kept smiling at her as if sending some kind of signal. In the past, Anne would not have paid any attention to him, because judging from his clothes, this man did not meet her mate selection criteria. But at this moment, she really needed someone to accompany her. So, without waiting for the other party to speak, Anne took the initiative to approach him. Who knew that after just a few words, the man claims to be a detective? The reason why he kept observing Anne was that he suspected that she was soliciting customers. At first, Anne didn't understand what was meant. When she reacted, she was already taken to the police car. It turned out that she was regarded as a prostitute who sold her body. The successive blows made Anne give up her proud self-esteem. She had to contact Dan to ask for bail, but the voice on the other end of the phone was him flirting with his new love. At this moment, Anne completely cut off the last thought of Dan in her heart. She no longer wanted to get his help, so Anne was detained for a whole night. In the end, it was the new neighbor who bailed her out, because it was a very shameful thing to go to the police station. So as soon as she got home, Anne awkwardly asked the other party not to make the matter public. And the neighbor was not the kind of person who talked about other people's privacy, and promised her in person that he would keep his mouth shut. And never thought that this man who came from a low-class family, dressed ordinary, and was not a few years older than her youngest son, was actually the first real gentleman she met after leaving her family. After repeated setbacks, Anne saw through the absurdity of relying on men. So Anne decided not to blindly look for a marriage partner, but to go to her sister. But when she was about to leave, George showed unusual reluctance. It turned out that he met a girl here, and because of their similar personalities and interests, the two soon became close friends. However, all good things must come to an end, and their different backgrounds also meant that they were destined to be apart. Soon Anne came to her sister's house, but her sister was not happy about their sudden visit. As soon as they entered the door, she issued an order to expel them. But Anne didn't mind, because the relationship between the two sisters seemed very tense, but in fact they cared about each other and refused to give in verbally. Suddenly, the sister asked Anne how she planned to make a living here. Originally, the two sons thought their mother would continue to look for men. Unexpectedly, the next second, they heard Anne say that she was going out to find a job. Everyone was stunned, because at that time, the jobs available to women were basically low-paid manual labor. And they would not believe that Anne, who had never touched women's shoes, would be willing to do manual labor. What was even more shocking was that the job Anne found was a tiring and dirty restaurant service. Although she was very busy at first and still gritted her teeth and persevered. Until this day, a wretched male customer openly molested her in broad daylight and reached out to touch her buttocks. And, who could no longer bear it, immediately picked up the coffee pot and poured the boiling coffee on the other person. According to common sense, the person who offended first should be held responsible. But at that time, women at the bottom had no dignity at all. In this way, Anne, who was obviously a victim, was eventually fired by her boss. Although she felt very wronged at first and soon adjusted her mood, and took the initiative to come to a paint store to apply for a job, but the clerk in charge of recruitment obviously did not take female job seekers seriously. So after symbolically asking and to fill out a form, he was ready to send her away casually. However, at this time, a female customer made a higher requirement for paint, seeing that the clerk could not answer, and took the initiative to step forward to help, then with her understanding of women and excellent communication skills. She won the trust of the female customer and successfully won a large order. For businessmen, as long as it is profitable, all other factors can be ignored. Therefore, when it was learned that and increased sales by 20% in just 3 weeks, the boss, who was originally dissatisfied with hiring female employees, suddenly looked at Anne with new eyes. Not only that, in the following interactions, the boss was also conquered by Anne's personal charm. So he took the initiative to pursue her, even though he decided not to rely on men. But if someone took the initiative to love herself and had no reason to refuse. Besides, the boss seemed sincere and kind. He was not only attentive to her, but also took special care of her 2 sons. On this day, Robbie, who loves performing, had the honor of participating in a drama performance, and the boss turned down his work and took the initiative to come to support him. When the performance was forced to end due to weather reasons, he took the lead in encouraging the lost Robbie so that he would not be too sad. In this way, under the boss's fierce offensive, Anne decided to enter the palace of marriage again. To celebrate, the family of 4 also came to the Wild for a dinner. But just when the boss raised his glass and was about to confess his inner love to and promise a beautiful future, the sudden appearance of a strange woman interrupted everything. At first, Anne naively thought that this person was the boss's sister. Unexpectedly, it was the boss's legitimate wife. It turned out that this so-called boss suffered from serious mental illness and always wanted to find different women to marry. As far as we know, Anne is already the 7th. Fortunately, he is the real heir of the Pigment family, and the attorney also paid a considerable amount of compensation. But even so, Anne still felt bitter inside, because what she wanted was never just money, but to be the only one in someone's heart. At this time, the boss's legitimate wife saw that and was so depressed. She took the initiative to come over to comfort her. Her husband was indeed a very good person, and it was not surprising that Anne fell in love with him. But Anne said that she didn't love him in fact, and she wanted to marry him just to have someone to rely on. On the contrary, why didn't you leave, sir, knowing that he had mental problems? Although the other party replied that it was because of love, and knew that the real reason was that she didn't have the courage to live alone. And she didn't really think that her husband was excellent, but just wanted to give herself more excuses, so that she could feel at ease and continue to stay with her husband and enjoy the rich life brought by her husband. After realizing this, Anne decided to take it as a warning. Continued to embark on a new journey, but George was unwilling to get in the car. Especially when he learned that he was about to go to Los Angeles, where Hollywood was, he rushed back to the room angrily. At first, Anne thought it was her sister who was making trouble behind her back and deliberately wanted to keep George, because her sister had been married for more than 10 years and had no children of her own. So she liked George, who was smart and handsome, from the bottom of her heart. Not only that, when she was packing her luggage earlier, her sister had also said in person that she was reluctant to let George leave, but in fact, it was George who wanted to stay. The reason was that he liked the school here and every friend he made here. After hearing this, Anne couldn't help but refute George's selfishness, but George said aggrievely that Anne never cared about his existence. Otherwise, why didn't she know what size shoes he wore for so long? I don't know what color he likes, and I don't know what books he likes to read. For a while, Anne was speechless because she was really guilty of her identity as a mother. She owed George a lot more. It turns out that before marrying Dan, Anne had been married before, and Robbie was born to her first husband. Because he grew up in a reconstituted family, Robbie is introverted and sensitive, which is in sharp contrast to George's lively and cheerful personality. On the contrary, because of his introverted personality, sensitive mind, and hobbies of embroidery and performance, he is often ridiculed as introverted and gentle. And always inevitably takes care of his emotions. The reason why she chose to go to Los Angeles this time is to let Robbie, who loves performance, seek greater development in Hollywood. As the unfavored party, George has been comforting himself for many years. Even if he has a lot of dissatisfaction in his heart, he has never imposed it on Robbie. But he is just a child after all, and he also needs the love from his parents. In fact, when he settled in the last city, Dan happened to be on tour there. Because he couldn't bear to watch his mother being played by a man, George planned to leave with Dan. Unexpectedly, Dan asked him to continue living with his mother, saying that he was too busy to take care of him. Perhaps it was because of Dan's abandonment that George, who was already lacking love, became even more insecure. So George wanted to make a willful confirmation whether he would not be abandoned by his mother under any circumstances. But by mistake, his mother chose to respect George's decision out of guilt and let him stay alone at his sister's house. In this way, Anne took Robbie on a journey to California. In the past, she always taught her children not to look back, but this time she couldn't help looking back. But unfortunately, she didn't see George catching up until the car completely drove away. Along the way, in order to earn extra money, Anne and Robbie picked up many travelers who needed to take a ride. At first, everything went smoothly, and they had a very happy chat with the passengers. A pair of young lovers with matching looks, bullying the weak mother and son. Not only did he want to ride for free without paying, he also planned to take advantage of the situation to rob. The criminal threatened Anne with a sharp knife, forcing her to obey out of fear and had to get out of the car to cooperate. Then he asked Robbie to take out all his savings, but he didn't expect Robbie to take out a pistol. Then he aimed at the man with the knife. At first, the man didn't believe that Robbie really had the courage to pull the trigger. But he obviously forgot that a gentle temperament does not mean a cowardly character. What's more, he was threatening the other party's mother. With a gunshot, the man was hit by a bullet at his feet. He was so scared that he quickly raised his hands and took the opportunity to get rid of the restraints. But when the mother and son were about to drive away, the other girl suddenly claimed that she was coerced into committing the crime. So, Anne, who was soft-hearted, agreed to take her on the road. Unexpectedly, during the break, the girl stole all the items in the car while they were having a meal. The man from before was driving nearby to meet them. Since almost all his belongings were stolen, Robbie could only secretly call George for help. At this time, George realized that in order to prevent him from being wronged, before leaving and left most of the compensation money to her sister. George was very moved when he learned the truth and realized that his mother's love for him had never disappeared. So after asking Robbie for the address, he couldn't wait to take the money and rushed to meet up with the mother and son. Robbie also temporarily kept it a secret from Anne and parked the car at the agreed location. When George appeared in sight, Anne's mouth began to rise uncontrollably. But thinking that the two were in a cold war, she awkwardly tried to put away her smile. During this period, George had already come to the car and took over Robbie's driving seat, and then he gave all the money to Anne, who was sitting in the passenger seat. When Anne took it with a reserved look and put the money in her handbag, George saw the books in the handbag, which were his favorite literary works. It turned out that after the last quarrel, Anne, who realized her shortcomings, began to take the initiative to learn everything about George. In fact, there is no normal mother in the world who really doesn't love her children. It's just that sometimes she is unable to do so that the love is not so obvious. The mother and her 2 children reconciled and set off again. They traveled day and night and finally arrived in the dream city of Los Angeles, originally, and also fantasized about living by the picturesque seaside and enjoying the beautiful scenery of sunrise and sunset. But the reality of the ending made them live in a dilapidated apartment. Not only that, in order to make up for the living expenses, they also sold the car they bought with a lot of money to others at a low price. After settling down temporarily, the 2 brothers went to the beach to play and bought some daily necessities. However, when she returned home with the things, she found that Dan had been waiting for a long time. Perhaps after experiencing all the styles, he knew that the original wife was the most caring person. So after seeing the business card sent by George and learning where Anne was living now, Dan came to seek reconciliation without hesitation. At first, he thought that with his charm and the friendship of more than 10 years of marriage, Anne would definitely change her mind. Little did he know that after experiencing various betrayals by men, Anne had already recognized the reality. You can believe in love and life, but you can't rely on it. You can enter the palace of marriage, but you can't regard marriage as a guarantee of life. As a band conductor, Dan once wrote a song called My Only One for Anne. It was used as a promise of love, and he became famous overnight because of the song. But because of this, he gradually forgot his original intention. However, Anne now rewrote the meaning of the song with her actions. The only one is no longer others, but the self that has been found. And, who decided to rely on herself, soon found a job as a supporting actress. Although she was exposed to the wind and sun all day, and even various accidents often occurred. And never complained about being tired, but calmly accepted the rough nature of life. But just when everything was going well, and received a call that Dan had died of a heart attack. Before this, George had always been resentful of Dan. But now that Dan had passed away, he didn't even have a chance to complain in person. And saw George's inner pain, so she comforted him earnestly. Although Dan had many shortcomings, no one could deny his love for you, not even you. So George should go to see him off now, instead of staying here and causing more regrets. So George bought the nearest flight and flew back to New York to attend the funeral. Unexpectedly, after arriving in New York, the school there learned that George had a talent for writing and was willing to provide him with a scholarship for him to continue his studies. And such treatment would not be possible in Los Angeles, even though he was reluctant to be separated from his family. But George finally chose to stay in New York and respected George's choice. But not long after, George changed his mind again. Because during the time George was separated from his mother, he found that he missed the time with his family more than pursuing his dreams. Since Anne and Robbie stayed on the set almost all day, George could only carry a suitcase to the set after arriving in Los Angeles. Unexpectedly, as soon as he entered the door, he happened to see Robbie, who was auditioning and was severely criticized by the director. It turned out that with Anne's active negotiations, Robbie, who wanted to become an actor, finally got the opportunity to audition. But no matter how the director trained him, he couldn't perform the desired effect. Seeing this, George immediately stepped forward and told Robbie to feel the role and get into the plot. After that, he looked at the script and practiced it himself. At this time, the director not far away saw the scene and was instantly attracted by George's handsome appearance and his emotional performance. In this way, George, who originally wanted to be a writer, was found to have more acting talent. So George signed a contract to become an actor. And Robbie, who originally wanted to be an actor, found that the work of costume on a set was actually more suitable for him. As for Anne, there is still no shortage of suitors around her. But Anne's necessities in life are no longer men or marriage, but the courage to keep looking for herself. As the saying goes, taking the initiative is better than passive waiting. Learn to plant flowers in your heart, and your life will not be barren. My Only One is directed by Richard Lonkirian, starring Renée Zellweger and Logan Lerman. A drama film released in 2009. This film is adapted from the personal experience of American actor George Hamilton George's mother, and originally a woman who only wanted to rely on men for life, but after experiencing her husband's infidelity and the shamelessness and betrayal of several men, she completely realized that in life, only oneself can be relied on. Although there were very few jobs for women to choose in that era, and they often encountered gender discrimination in the workplace. But Anne still opened up a smooth road of her own with her tenacity and the belief that she would never look back. Not only that, under her influence, her two sons also found a goal to fight for their whole lives. Well, today's movie sharing is here. Welcome to like, comment, and forward. Thank you for your patience. Looking forward to meeting you next time.